This is Wellington. That's the train I came in on, being shunted back to the yard. This is episode F of Rakaia, 1899. So trains, as we first knew them, were wagon loads of minerals descending from some pithead to some quay up in the north somewhere under the influence of gravity. The challenge back then was as much about getting them to stop as it was to get them to move. And that challenge remains as real today as it was centuries ago. And that challenge was obviously a feature in the Rakaia collision of 1899. To understand the challenge of braking, there's some principles that we need to cover off. The first is that braking is a transfer of the kinetic energy in the moving body, such as a train, into heat at the brake blocks. The second is that braking doesn't occur in a straight line. There's an initial period of no effect, and braking becomes more efficient as speed drops. So it's that whole energy cannot be created or destroyed mantra that we learnt back at high school. So speed and momentum, for instance, becomes heat and sparks. In a railway context, we know that sand gets applied to the rails in order to increase adhesion to get a train moving, but sand is also applied to the rails to increase the braking effect, to increase the friction between the braking train and the rails. In a modern system, the application of a train's emergency brakes also activates the sanding mechanism. But in 1899, it was necessary for a driver to apply the brakes and then apply the sander. Another thing worth noting is that Hollywood loves the image of a train's tyres being braked solid so that they skid along the rail. That's Hollywood rather than reality. If that were to occur, what it means is that the kinetic energy is only transferred to heat at that one point where the tyre hits the rail. Whereas if the wheel is left to rotate, the kinetic energy transfer happens through the entire length of the brake block. It's much more efficient, even though at first blush it sounds counterintuitive. For the trains converging on Rakaia on that long ago Saturday evening, there were two ways of actuating the brakes. One was by hand, the other was by way of the Westinghouse air brake. Hand actuation is the easiest one and the most common. There were screw brakes in each train's guard stand, on each carriage and on each locomotive's tender. This example is from the cab of a small industrial locomotive rather than a mainline express locomotive, but the example still stands. A hand-actuated wheel atop a capstan which rotates a screw thread that acts on a series of rods and levers and shafts that brings the shoe into contact with the tyres. 3 or 4 quick turns will do the trick, so it's a relatively quick application. For decades, such brakes were the only brakes. And in the wake of the Rakaia collision, the then locomotive engineer for the Huranui Bluff section of railway, Mr. Alfred Luther Beatty, who we will meet in a subsequent episode, told Parliament's Railway Committee that he had no issue with the T-class of locomotive, for instance, bringing 80 to 90 laden goods wagons to a stop using the screw brake on the tender. And that's fine perhaps for routine braking from a low speed, but for higher speeds or emergency braking, it's possible to argue that Mr. Beatty was being a tad disingenuous.
The next Johnsonville line service to Johnsonville, stopping at all stations, departs from platform 1 in 10 minutes.
In very simple terms, the Westinghouse air brake works by the control of air pressure on either side of the brake piston, and by manipulating the air pressure through the brake valve in the locomotive's cab or the valve on the locomotive's tender, the driver or fireman can hold the brakes on to the required degree, release the brakes, or put the brakes into emergency full. The way the air is manipulated from one side of the braking piston is by venting it to the atmosphere, and in emergency braking the biggest vent is used, and locomotive drivers today still use the slang term going for the big hole, by which they mean the biggest vent, by which they mean the air is evacuated and pressure drops to zero very, very quickly. Back in 1899, drivers like Frank Roberts used the expression wiping the dial, and what they meant was that when the biggest vent was opened, the big hole was opened, the air pressure on the dial would very quickly be wiped to zero. The Westinghouse brake came fitted as standard to the 1885 N class of locomotives, and it acted on the driving wheels only. For someone like Charles Henry Carter, the driver of the second picnic train, who had 22 years worth of experience, he would have started out in a locomotive like the ubiquitous F class with its equally ubiquitous handbrake. He would probably have served on the N class of locomotive with its Westinghouse air brake, and of course he would also have been expected from time to time to bring 80 or 90 laden goods wagons to a stop using the hand actuated brake on the tender only. And we know that Charles Henry Carter finished his career on that fatal night in 1899 driving the American U class of locomotives with its air brakes on the driving wheels and on the tender wheels. We know that the first picnic train came to a halt at Rakaia using the braking power of the lead locomotive only. What we don't know is whether that was via the tender handbrake, as Mr. Beattie would have liked, or using the tender air, initially that is, to bunch the carriages up before the locomotive air brake brought the train to a halt. We know that driver Gardner had his train well in hand, as the expression went, so it is possible that the tender handbrake was used as the first part of braking. In terms of the second picnic train, what we know today and what driver Carter knew back on that night are of course different things. So when we look at how the second picnic train was braked, we need to remember our benefit of hindsight, that of course only became available to driver Carter the hard way. On the footplate of U284 that night, we know that steam had been cut off back at the dip, and the deepest part of the dip is about a mile from the station limits. We know that the locomotive, after steam was cut off, was coasting, or to use the correct term, drifting. As far as braking went, the fireman Frank Mather had already screwed down the tender handbrake by the time U284 had gotten to the Mount Orford Road level crossing, a bit under half a mile from the point of collision. Whether this was done because of an explicit order from driver Carter or a nod of the head, we'll never know. It may also simply have been part of an unspoken routine worked out by the two men during their time working together. What we do know is that Harry and Frank saw James O'Neill's red lamp at about the same time that Harry Carter whistled for a signal. And when both men saw that lamp, either in call or answer or simultaneously, they would have cried, "Red, red." Harry Carter went for the big hole and wiped the dial. He also opened the sander. Although on such a wild night, there's some question as to how much of the sand would have actually have made it to the railhead. His whistling for a signal also turned into whistling for brakes, and he called to his mate, "Quick Frank, cut in the tender air." That might seem incongruous with the tender handbrake having already been applied, but Mather's evidence is that he felt the tender air brake take a greater effect than the handbrake. It's easy to imagine the weight carried in those few words from Harry to Frank. It's easy to imagine the realization coming upon Harry Carter that moments ago what looked like the red tail lights of the first picnic train receding through Rakaia's yard were in fact the red tail lights of the first picnic train parked and imperiled at Rakaia's platform. And as all of that was unfolding, and as the distance to the first picnic train clicked down, and as the speed of the second picnic train too slowly fell away, and as way up ahead of the first picnic train its crew hurried to get their train into motion in the forlorn hope that even at the last moment a collision may be averted, Harry Carter on U284
Next station, Fox Hill.
Harry Carter tried something called reversing. Now in my mind, reversing is having the locomotive's wheels rotate contrary to the direction, but that's not the case. Reversing is much more subtle than that and much more efficient. The locomotive equivalent of a gear stick is called the reversing lever, and it works by controlling the valve system. When it's located full forward, if steam is applied, the locomotive moves forward.
Next station, Owenwa Street.
If there's a need to reverse, the locomotive is brought to a stop, the lever is engaged in full reverse, steam is applied, and the locomotive moves backwards. The thing to remember with a steam locomotive is that unlike a car, there is no neutral. If the driving wheels are rotating, then the valve mechanism that controls the ingress and egress of steam to the cylinders is also working. What reversing means is that when a locomotive is drifting and the reversing lever is applied, it changes the relationship between the valve system and the cylinders and turns the cylinders into a giant air compressor. That air compressor sucks air in through the exhaust, compresses it up, and forces that air up the steam pipe in an attempt to pressurize the boiler. It can't because the steam valve is turned off. So instead it pressurizes the steam valve, it pressurizes the valves themselves, and it pressurizes the cylinders. And that pressurization creates an incredible amount of heat very quickly. In fact, if reversing goes on too long, the lubricants in the cylinders boil away, the brazing that has been used to build the cylinder blocks can melt, and the brass seals inside the cylinders can distort. In an emergency situation, reversing is a last resort. What we do know about reversing is that it can be used in a shunting or a low speed context to save repeated applications of the handbrake, or in an air-fitted locomotive to save on the need to continually recharge the air reservoir.
Next station, Lyle.
The damage doesn't occur because the speeds are much slower. What we know about Rakaia 1899 is that reversing must have been left late because U284 was classed as fit for service later that very night. And what we do know is, of course, that the kinetic energy that hadn't yet been converted into heat at the brake blocks on U284 and its tender were converted to the energy that destroyed the last 4 vehicles of that first picnic train, and in doing so injured scores of passengers and killed 4 more on that long ago and rather bitter Saturday night that was then and would remain the colony's worst railway disaster. Like, subscribe, enjoy, don't enjoy, up to you.